That was a clip from the 1896 silent film Le Manoir du Diable, or House of the Devil. This film at first glance may not seem like anything all that special, but this was one of the most important cinematic events in the history of filmmaking. This was one of the first showcases of how on-screen entertainment could be used to frighten just as much as it could delight. This is the first ever horror film. Horror is one of the most well-known genres in film, and that's not surprising. After all, scary stories have always been something people love to share. Despite this, many people don't give much thought to its history or how the genre has evolved over the years. Horror films have come a very long way since their inception, and it's fascinating to see the many different eras that the genre has gone through, and how it has reflected society's changing fears over time. Today, I invite you on a little trip through the haunted reels of days gone by. Together, we shall take a look back at the long and rich history of the horror genre. Welcome to Killers, Cults, and Cameras, a history of horror cinema. When horror films first started out, they were silent productions. Due to this limitation, they were forced to scare the audience without the use of dialogue, and so the scares were provided via use of shocking and intense imagery. The films often used early special effects combined with trick cinematography in order to create a number of supernatural events. Horror during this time period didn't often tackle real-world threats, focusing mainly on ghosts, living skeletons, and the devil. They often featured heavy religious symbolism and preyed on the public's fears of the unexplained, possibly supernatural events. British filmmaker and magician Walter R. Booth was a pioneer in early horror cinema, as he developed a special effect that could make it appear as if a head was floating while still being animate. For the early days of horror, it was often used as more of a showcase for spooky effects, rather than to be actually disturbing for audiences. This would change, however, with the arrival of the early 1900s. During this time, people began to adapt more horror literature into on-screen performances. It was in Western Europe where one of horror's first milestones took place. A new style, named expressionist horror, exploded onto the scene. Using dramatic cinematography and exaggerated sets in order to create a sense of unease, expressionist horror would become the grandfather of one of horror's greatest subgenres, psychological horror. This is best represented in the 1920s film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a film which revolutionized horror films by using its strange cinematography and set design to create an almost lopsided feel to it, which, in conjunction with its other striking visuals, made it an experience that no one had ever seen before. The film also proved that horror cinema could be commercially successful, which pushed more filmmakers to try their hand at the genre, such as in 1922 when F.W. Munro went on to make the original Nosferatu, which to this day is still regarded as having some of the most unsettling moments in horror history. Meanwhile, in 1920s America, another milestone in horror history was about to be made. Universal Pictures began to try their hand at adapting famous novels into horror films, starting with The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, and then following with The Phantom of the Opera in 1925. Universal horror exploded into the 1930s, releasing both Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931. With movies being past the era of silent films by this point, Universal would use this to their advantage, featuring lots of dialogue between the main characters in these movies, along with stellar performances by the actors portraying the monsters.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
These two films helped lay the foundation for horror cinema to come, and pushed studios to focus less on the paranormal side of horror in favor of big-budget monster movies. Gothic horror would dominate the 30s and the 40s, with films such as The Invisible Man, Bride of Frankenstein, and The Wolf Man delivering on the big-budget scares audiences were looking for. But behind the scenes, there was another style of horror starting to show its face. It started when a newspaper journalist named Val Lewton was approached by RKO Pictures with an offer. RKO offered to produce a series of horror films, of which Lewton would have full creative control over. The two catches the studio presented was the fact that the budgets for these movies would be extremely low, and the studio would have final say on the name of the movies. Luton agreed, and went on to make several low-budget horror films, starting with the 1942 film The Cat People. Due to the extremely low budget of the film, Luton couldn't rely on spooky sets or extravagant monsters to create the scares, and instead took an approach that focused on atmosphere, mood, and suspense. Several others were made using this same strategy, such as The Uninvited, Ghost Ship, and The Body Snatcher. This type of horror, one which did away with the big budget scares in favor of tone and suspense, would eventually become known as the thriller subgenre. The early 1950s began the rise of science fiction horror. The post-World War II world was aware and afraid of the power of atomic weapons, radiation, and technology far beyond the human race. Films reflected that in the monsters that they would showcase. Giant bugs, atomic mutations, botched experiments, and aliens from outer space became commonplace in horror cinema. In 1951, The Thing from Another World was released, featuring not only a plant-based alien that feeds on human blood, but also featured the first on-screen full-body fire stunt, when the monster is doused with kerosene and lit ablaze at the end of the movie. Up to this point, most movie monsters, even if they weren't human, were usually at least humanoid in some way. In 1954, however, two films would release that would break that trend. The first and lesser known of the two is the film Them, which featured enormous mutated ants, brought to life through incredible practical effects that still impress many to this day. The film was a pioneer in the giant insect trope featured in many horror and sci-fi productions. Meanwhile, over in Japan, speaking of the West, the late 50s would mark another shift in horror history, thanks to the work of a single company, Hammer Pictures. Founded in 1934, Hammer Pictures originally wasn't focused on creating horror films, instead working on relatively low-budget British movies that wouldn't gather all that much attention. But in the late 50s, they finally dipped their hand into the horror genre, breaking down all expectations when they released Curse of Frankenstein, a more violent and striking retelling of the original story. The film, while not a critical success, was beloved by audiences and made over 70 times its budget back, proving that the classic Gothic monster movies still had a large audience. Hammer immediately began working on more reinterpretations of many of the classic monster movies, creating the subgenre known as Hammer horror. The films were similar in many ways to the original Gothic horror films released by Universal, but abandoned the subtle scares and quiet, chilling atmosphere in favor of more violence, sex, and intense death scenes. Also, due to advances in technology, Hammer Horror was able to take full advantage of the rise of colored film. Using their revolutionary Technicolor cameras, Hammer Horror was the first horror subgenre to use color as part of its identity, with bright and exaggerated colors often being used in the films. In fact, one of the most iconic visuals from Hammer Horror is the bright red blood that was used. It was so visually striking that bright red blood has become a staple of the subgenre, and even in more recent films such as 1999's Sleepy Hollow, the distinctively colored blood is used to evoke the same style as the original Hammer Horror films. The most famous of Hammer Horror's numerous reinterpretations of the classic monsters is Horror of Dracula, released in 1958. The film featured the first appearance of famous actor Sir Christopher Lee as Dracula, who would go on to reprise the role 9 additional times, 6 of which were sequels to Horror of Dracula. Hammer remained popular for several years to come, before finally petering out in the late 70s. While Hammer Horror dominated the Gothic horror market, another film was about to be made that took a very different approach to frightening its audience. In 1960, that film was released, a film that marks the creation of one of horror's most famous subgenres. Psycho was a film that general audiences did not see coming. For years now, horror had been known for its monsters, ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and more. but Psycho featured none of that. There was no elaborate monster costume, no supernatural threat. The monster of the film was a man, a disturbed individual that committed atrocities against others, often those who were in vulnerable and powerless positions. The film felt more real and played into the very real-world fear of murderers and stalkers. Psycho's influence on horror history cannot be understated, as it was the final stepping stone to the birth of my personal favorite part of horror, the slasher subgenre. Despite Psycho's success, the slasher genre didn't explode into the mainstream for some time. We'll get to the rise of slasher films in a little bit. In 1968, 2 films would release that would help usher in a new era of horror movies. The first was the infamous Night of the Living Dead, which would introduce audiences to a lesser-known type of movie monster, one that, due to this film's portrayal, would go to be the staple of countless films, games, and novels: zombies. Created by George A. Romero, the independently produced horror film was shocking to audiences, with its vivid and graphic violence being a draw to many. At the time, several critics claimed the film went too far with the graphic imagery, despite the film not even being shot in color. Despite this, the film grew a cult following relatively quickly, and is now often recognized as the first mainstream introduction to what we now know as zombies. The second film to release that year took a very different approach. Rosemary's Baby was a supernatural horror film that showcased a twisted perversion of pregnancy. The film evoked an extremely claustrophobic mood and explored controversial concepts such as religious extremists, the Antichrist, and Satanism. The film was a massive success, making over 10 times its budget back, and even being nominated for the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. The film's success kick-started the rise of occult horror, which would go on to be one of mainstream horror's most popular subgenres. Studios were scrambling to jump on the occult horror train, and just a few years later, in 1973, a film would release that many consider to be the crown jewel of the subgenre, and to some, the scariest movie ever released. The Exorcist. Most people have at least heard of this movie, and many are too frightened to watch it themselves. A film that became infamous for people running out of the theaters out of fear, disgust, or a combination of the two. The film delved into themes and imagery that were disturbing by a level previously unseen by the public. The picture of a young girl with cracked skin spewing bile and spinning her head like a top was too much for a lot of audiences. Some organizations even attempted to prevent the movie from being released on home video, claiming that the movie could enact permanent psychological damage on those who viewed it. Despite the backlash, the movie was an enormous hit, making $441 million on a $12 million budget. The film also set a massive milestone for the horror genre, being the first ever horror film to be nominated for Best Picture. The Exorcist's influence can still be found on the horror genre years later, with many different studios trying to replicate the feeling the movie gave back when it was released. And despite all these years and the countless horror films that have come after, many still claim that to them, The Exorcist is the scariest movie ever made. Moving away from supernatural horror for a while, in 1974 we would see the next stepping stone in the slasher film genre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was an independent film made by Tobe Hooper, and shows the story of a young group of teens who, while traveling across rural Texas, get caught up and become victims of a small family of cannibals, who in the later sequels would be identified as the Sawyer family. Though not originally intended for a widespread theatrical release, the movie became so popular via word of mouth that it was given a widespread release less than 2 weeks after its original debut. The film, despite not actually showing much blood or gore, was deemed so disturbing by audiences that it was actually banned by the British Board of Film Censors, and would not become available in a physical format in Britain until 1999. The film also featured what many believe to be the first of the titans of the horror genre, The character of Leatherface, despite not even being the sole antagonist, is what gave Texas Chainsaw its lasting legacy, with the character appearing in every single film in the franchise and becoming the face of what I refer to as the hellbilly side of horror. A name inspired by musician and horror film director Rob Zombie, the hellbilly style often focuses on harsh yellow or red lighting, themes of cannibalism or rabid animals, violent and graphic imagery, intense editing, and having a heavy southwestern aesthetic. That same year, another slasher would be released, and while its impact isn't quite as strong as Texas Chainsaw's was, it would still play an important role in the rise of the slasher subgenre. Black Christmas was a film that helped form the skeletal structure for the ideal slasher movie. Created by Bob Clark, the movie tells the story of a sorority house who is stalked and hunted by a murderer over Christmas break. The killer harasses his victims over the phone before going in for the kill, a trope that would become popularized by the Scream franchise years later. Throughout the movie, more and more of the women are killed by the mysterious murderer. The film, while relatively tame by modern horror movie standards, still has a unique identity thanks to its talented performers, stellar camera work, and unique setting. The film's most lasting impact on the history of horror is what it would go on to inspire. A man by the name of John Carpenter was impressed by Black Christmas, and through a conversation with Bob Clark was inspired to begin working on a slasher film of his own. The horror genre would have two small highlights pop up in the following couple years. 1975's Shivers, made by David Cronenberg, brought more attention to horror films that prided themselves on their gore and special effects, while also diving headfirst into the sexual undertones that could often be found in the horror cinema. The whole movie could be a decent allegory for the fear of sexual disease. In 1976, Carrie would be released. Based on the novel by master of literary horror Stephen King, Carrie was a psychological horror film that helped grant awareness to the idea of teen horror films that primarily focused on teenagers dealing with personal problems of their own while also having to deal with the primary threat of the movie. The film tackles the very real-world struggles of a young girl named Carrie, who is caught up in a cycle of bullying, having an abusive mother, and transitioning into a young woman. She then discovers she has mental powers and tries to hide them from the rest of the world. The film delves into the tragic state of her life and how the constant buildup of stress and anger can eventually lead to her actions at the end of the film, where she finally snaps and takes vengeance on those who she believes has wronged her. The film was very successful and was a showcase that Stephen King's lengthy and complicated novels could translate well into a film format. The horror genre was doing well overall. The people were happy with the scares and studios were making good money. Despite this, the genre was still more niche than others, and was struggling to produce a product that gathered positive reception from the press. However, in the year of 1978, a film would be released that would change the horror genre forever. John Carpenter had finished working on a slasher film of his own, a film so famous that its soundtrack alone is among the most recognizable in all of cinema. A movie that brought the slasher subgenre into the spotlight, and would go on to inspire countless others that would come after it. Halloween, the crown jewel of the slasher genre, and one of the most famous horror movies ever created. Made on a budget of only $300,000, the film would revolutionize the slasher subgenre, and show people just how effective a good villain can be in making a horror film memorable. The film tells the story of Laurie Strode, a babysitter who, on Halloween night, is stalked and attacked by a silent masked killer, intent on murdering the citizens of the small town of Haddonfield. While the film's cinematography, writing, gore, and soundtrack are all done fantastically, what makes the film as memorable as it is undoubtedly its main killer, Michael Myers, a silent, cold, unfeeling murderer who kills without reason and seemingly cannot be stopped. Something about Michael Myers stuck with people in a way no horror villain prior to that point ever really had. Even famous killers like Norman Bates and Leatherface lacked the overwhelming and bone-chilling presence that Michael Myers emitted. The film was a massive success, much to the surprise of its creators, earning over $70 million worldwide. Since then, the Halloween franchise has become one of the biggest names in all of horror, with Michael Myers appearing in all but one of the movies. The franchise has also inspired countless other slashers, some of which would go on to be its biggest competitors, and many of which have been forgotten over the many years. Despite the stiff competition, Michael is who many consider to be the greatest horror villain ever made, with only two others really being competitors for the title. Whatever your opinion of these films may be, the proclaimed King of Horror will continue to haunt the nightmares of audiences both young and old, and those who seek to claim his throne will learn the hard way that no matter how hard you try,
You can't kill the boogeyman.
Turning away from the urban streets of Haddonfield, another filmmaker wanted to take us on a journey somewhere else, somewhere colder, darker, into the far reaches of space. In 1979, Ridley Scott's second directorial film was released, Alien. While most horror films preferred to focus on gothic set pieces or regular life locations, Alien drenched itself in its sci-fi roots, featuring claustrophobic industrial hallways and dark, otherworldly tunnel systems. Thanks to its Academy Award-winning special effects, the film also gave us one of the most famous movie monsters ever made, the Xenomorphs. The film follows Ellen Ripley, played perfectly by Sigourney Weaver, and the rest of her crew aboard the Nostromo spacecraft. On an expedition, one of the crew members is attacked and implanted with an alien offspring, which then breaks loose on the ship and begins wreaking havoc, eventually growing into the now iconic Xenomorph. Although the film is often outshined by its more action-centric sequel, Aliens, the first film is still praised for its contributions to both the sci-fi and horror genres, as well as having one of the most universally praised female leads in cinema, in the form of Ellen Ripley. 1980 would mark the creation of two of the horror genre's most famous properties. With the explosion of the slasher subgenre thanks to Halloween, many young filmmakers were looking to try and repeat the success by making low-effort slasher films for a couple $100,000. Thankfully, studios were also excited to try and recapture the success of Halloween and bring in the audience that they knew existed. Many failed to do so, but there was one that did manage to break through the veil. The studio Paramount Pictures would find the success they were looking for in 1980 when they would release a movie called Friday the 13th. Being nearly identical to Halloween in terms of tone and style, the film would make a few key changes in order to create a unique identity. The film was set in a fictional summer camp called Camp Crystal Lake, rather than an urban town, focused less on story, preferring to showcase its gore done by the master of special effects Tom Savini, and unlike Halloween, the killer wasn't the focal point of the movie. Rather, the killer was a mystery for most of the film, before being revealed to be the insane Pamela Voorhees at the end. Pamela blames the camp counselors for her son's perceived death, and is out for revenge. She is ultimately killed at the end of the film, beheaded while trying to kill the last of the counselors. The film did very well, grossing almost $60 million on a $550,000 budget, and would spawn a host of sequels, varying greatly in quality and scare factor. However, if you aren't a hardcore fan of the series, you may be confused, as despite being the main killer in the first movie, Pamela Voorhees is not what most people think of when they hear Friday the 13th. Jason Voorhees, son of Pamela and main killer of the franchise, one of only two horror villains said to be on the same tier as Michael Myers, an enormous, unstoppable juggernaut of a man with one single purpose: murder any trespassers upon Camp Crystal Lake as revenge for the death of his mother. Despite starting out as a relatively carbon copy of Michael Myers in the second film, over the course of time, Jason would go on to forge his own unique identity, donning his iconic hockey mask in the third film and being resurrected as an undead, supernatural monster of a man in Part 6. Due to their inherent similarities as silent, masked, unstoppable killers, Jason and Michael are often compared by fans, debating which one stands as the superior slasher villain. In fact, both are so often compared that non-horror fans often confuse them for each other. Whatever your personal preference is, Jason over the years has undoubtedly cemented his rightful place as one of the top 3 greatest slasher villains of all time. That same year, another one of Stephen King's novels would be adapted into a feature film, arguably his most famous story, The Shining. Directed by Stanley Kubrick, The Shining is a psychological horror film that tells the story of the Torrance family, featuring Wendy, Jack, and their son, Danny. Jack has been assigned as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel. However, the hotel is haunted both by the souls of previous victims and the evil spirits who have caused the bloody history of the hotel. The audience also learns early on that Danny has something referred to as the Shine, and gives him the ability to predict coming events, see supernatural spirits, and communicate with others who possess the Shine telepathically. The film was a slow burn, showing how over the course of the months spent there, the spirits slowly drive Jack mad, sending him on a murderous rampage at the end of the film where he attempts to kill his family. The film does an amazing job at showcasing how the family is affected by the isolation and inherent madness of the hotel, and how each one of them deals with things differently. Through use of clever cinematography, in conjunction with the striking architecture, the movie makes the hotel feel daunting and oppressive, almost claustrophobic despite the large open space and well-kept interior. The film also pushed the boundaries for how sound can be used to enhance a film's atmosphere, with several points in the film being completely devoid of music, and rather having the audience just listen to the sounds of the hotel, whether it be Danny's big wheel on the hardened floors, or Jack bouncing a tennis ball off the hotel walls. The film's highlight is easily Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance. Jack is able to bring a very frightening energy to the role, and thanks to his stellar performance, gave us one of the most famous movie quotes of all time.
Here's Johnny!
Despite its popularity, The Shining was a critical failure upon its release. And to rub salt in the wound, the original author, Stephen King, reportedly hated the movie for its portrayal of Jack. King would even go on to produce a TV miniseries of The Shining in 1997 in an effort to bring what he wanted to the screen. But ironically enough, the miniseries was disliked by many fans of the book and original film for its poor pacing and far less threatening atmosphere. Despite the mixed reception, the original film is still seen as a masterpiece by many people, often sitting towards the top of people's scariest movies of all time list. With the rise of VHS media, many horror productions were being made with the intent of being popular on home video, focusing heavily on gruesome practical effects rather than chilling atmosphere or interesting drama. In 1981, Renaissance Pictures released a film by the name of The Evil Dead, a film which would grow a massive cult following in the horror fandom due to its brilliant practical effects and overwhelming pacing. The film would fall into what many call the video nasties list, films which featured extremely gory, gross imagery, and were often criticized or even defamed by the press, social commenters, and religious organizations, but would still become popularized through home media. While still beloved by many fans of horror, much of The Evil Dead's popularity would actually come from its sequels, which feature the main protagonist, Ash Williams, portrayed famously by Bruce Campbell, finding crazy ways to fight his way out of supernatural circumstances he finds himself in. Over time, and after numerous appearances in both film and comics, as well as a TV show, the franchise has become one of the few horror properties to be remembered for its hero rather than its villain. In the wave of extreme practical effects being a draw for horror movies, a film would rise up to be the standout of what one is capable of achieving using practical effects. In 1982, a remake of The Thing from Another World would be released, simply titled The Thing. Made by John Carpenter, still riding high after the success of Halloween, the film was meant to showcase how a group of people, cut off from the rest of the world, would react to the knowledge that there is a shape-shifting alien among them, one that can spread to others via so much as a drop of blood. While the film is praised currently for its strong tension, good acting, and absolutely phenomenal effects, when the film was first released, the reception was very different. Many audiences and critics bashed the movie for being way too gross, and the film suffered heavily due to bad press, not making the money that its creators were looking for. The film was such a disappointment financially that John Carpenter even lost the directing role for the 1984 film Firestarter, which was based off another famous Stephen King novel. It wouldn't be until it was released on home video that the film began to get the recognition that it deserves. Thankfully, the film did grow a cult following over the years, and people now look back on it very fondly, with many saying it's one of the best horror films ever made. Moving back to the slasher subgenre for a bit, the early 80s was home to a lot of low-budget slashers, many of which were not very well made, and despite the effort, no slasher killers seemed to stick with audiences the way Michael and Jason had. Films like My Bloody Valentine, Maniac, and Slumber Party Massacre, while enjoyed by many, weren't showcasing the staying power studios were looking for. However, in 1984, a man by the name of Wes Craven would direct a film that finally had the staying power that a slasher franchise needs. A film that would give rise to a new face of the slasher subgenre, and a character that many people would find haunting their dreams. A Nightmare on Elm Street gave something that audiences hadn't really seen out of slasher films to that point yet. Most slasher villains were big, strong, masked men with few words to say and very little supernatural aspects to them, if any at all. But Nightmare's killer was very different. He was thin, wore no mask, cracked jokes at his victims' expense, and had a host of supernatural powers of which to torment the vulnerable teens of Elm Street with. Due to his unique identity and masterful portrayal by actor Robert Englund, the name Freddy Krueger would quickly become known by audiences, and the character would go on to be the third most famous of the main titans of horror, becoming just as popular as Michael and Jason. The movie is the story of Nancy Thompson and how she and the other teens are being killed by the spirit of Freddy Krueger, a child murderer who, after being burned alive by the parents of the town, has returned to prey on the children of those who killed him by entering into their dreams and killing them. Due to his unique nature as a dream demon, the filmmakers could play a lot more with Freddy's powers and what was needed to escape from him. A Nightmare on Elm Street was a massive success, and several sequels followed it, with Robert Englund returning to reprise the role of Freddy 8 times, 7 of which were sequels to A Nightmare on Elm Street, and once in a spin-off TV show called Freddy's Nightmares. Freddy would even have a crossover with Jason Voorhees in 2003 in Freddy vs. Jason, where audiences would get to watch the two iconic slashers duke it out with each other. Due to Robert Englund's iconic portrayal of Freddy, many people consider the role uniquely his, unlike Jason and Michael, who, due to their silent, masked nature, can have almost anyone with the right build behind the role. Any talk of recasting Freddy is often met with heavy debate, which we will see more about later. With the success of the Nightmare franchise proving that having a unique and recognizable villain helped with popularity, and films like The Evil Dead and The Thing pushing the limits of practical effects, some filmmakers began trying to combine different styles of horror to create a new experience. In 1987, Clive Barker would direct a film that borrowed elements from the slasher, monster, and supernatural horror genres to create one of my personal favorite horror films of the era, Hellraiser. The film is an incredible showcase of practical effects combined with clever editing. The movie also focused on excessive themes of body horror and sexual deviance. The standout figure of the movie, and the franchise that would spawn from it, is undoubtedly the lead Cenobite, better known as Pinhead. Originally portrayed by Doug Bradley, Pinhead not only had a striking design, but also a very powerful presence. He felt otherworldly, and thanks to the excellent script and great presentation, was a truly frightening figure to witness. Despite his infamy, he is actually not the main antagonist of the first or second film. Rather, he acts as more of a third party who seeks to punish the film's main antagonist, Frank, but also is perfectly willing to drag innocents down into the underworld as well. It wouldn't be until the third film that Pinhead would take up the role as the primary antagonist. The franchise would make a name for itself with its distinct and disturbing body horror-centric imagery and the many Cenobites that would appear over the course of the films. Sadly, after the lackluster performance of the fourth film, Hellraiser: Bloodline, the series would go direct to video, with the quality of the movies seeming to get worse with each entry. Doug Bradley didn't even return to the role of Pinhead in the final two films, causing even more backlash than before. Luckily, in 2022, the franchise would reinstate itself with a reboot film on Hulu. Despite many changes to the original, including a now female Pinhead, the film was a success and leaves many fans looking forward to what the franchise will offer next. In the late 80s, slasher films were still going very strong. Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th in particular had released several successful sequels. Halloween 4 had just brought back Michael Myers after his absence in the third film, and even Texas Chainsaw had made a huge comeback with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. The Titans of horror were running unchallenged, and it was time for a new face to step in the ring. In 1988, Studio MGM released a slasher film with a brand new type of killer. One that, while maybe not quite as well respected as Michael, Jason, and Freddy, is arguably more well known by the general public. The movie was called Child's Play and was the world's first introduction to Chucky, the killer doll. Chucky, voiced by the exceptionally talented Brad Dourif, was a real shift from your traditional slasher. There had been killer dolls in horror before, such as Fats in the 1978 film Magic, but Chucky was one of the first ones to take on a slasher role. Not only was he significantly smaller in stature than most other killers, but his unique, raunchy personality and sense of humor helped him stand out and made Child's Play as memorable as it was. The film was able to make Chucky feel like a doll come to life thanks to the work of 9 separate puppeteers, all working in sync to make the Chucky animatronic move the way that they needed. The film was a big hit with horror fans, with many people saying that Chucky was just as scary as the other titans of the slasher genre. The Child's Play franchise would take off pretty quickly after the first film. Universal Pictures bought the rights and began working on sequel films for the killer doll to terrorize. Audiences liked Chucky and wanted to see more of him. After the third film failed to live up to the first two in the eyes of many, the franchise would take a break for a few years before being brought back in 1998 with the fan-favorite film Bride of Chucky. On top of updating Chucky's appearance, Bride introduced a new killer doll for Chucky to bounce off of, his wife Tiffany, voiced by Jennifer Tilly. Over the years, Chucky has become the unchallenged face of the killer doll subgenre, and is one of the few slasher villains whose movies tell a consistent and continuous story, whereas other slasher franchises like Halloween and Texas Chainsaw would often struggle with keeping an accurate timeline of events and avoiding obvious retcons. The Child's Play franchise is still a fan favorite today, with the 2021 Chucky TV show being well received by both new viewers of the franchise and longtime fans. Although sadly, according to the creator of the franchise, Don Mancini, the show will not be returning for a 4th season. Despite this, fans of horror are positive the little devil will show his face again in the coming years and eagerly await his return. As the slasher genre dominated the late 80s and early 90s, some audiences were beginning to get a little tired of so many similar films coming out. They wanted something different, something new, something that didn't rely solely on jump scares and gore to frighten its audience. In 1991, audiences would receive just that. Directed by Jonathan Demme, the psychological thriller known as Silence of the Lambs would give audiences a new kind of horror experience. The film shows us the life of FBI trainee Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, as she seeks to track down and catch a serial killer by the name of Buffalo Bill, who is known for murdering and skinning women. In order to do this, she seeks help from another imprisoned serial killer. Despite Buffalo Bill being the film's main antagonist and the primary threat, the face of the movie is undoubtedly the killer Clarice is aided by, a character who many claim to not only be one of the greatest horror movie villains, but one of the greatest villains in all of cinema, the notorious cannibalistic Hannibal Lecter. Played by Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal was disturbing, smart, charismatic, and insane all at the same time. His calm, calculated demeanor and sophisticated speech was a stark contrast to the silent, brutal slashers and loudmouth jokester killers that the slasher genre had popularized. Hannibal the Cannibal was unique in a way most horror villains struggle to be, and few would say he isn't just as well known as the titans like Jason, Michael, and Freddy. He almost occupies his own category of horror titans, with a performance so distinct and a character so masterfully portrayed that he is often very hard to compare to other horror villains due to how unique of a character he truly is. Silence of the Lambs surpassed all expectations, making $273 million on a $19 million budget. However, its most notable impact on horror cinema came in the form of its critical praise. For years, horror media was seen as a cheap, lesser form of entertainment by many critics. Despite the amount of time and effort that went into many of the films, horror was not respected by the Academy, and it was extremely difficult for horror films to be nominated for Academy Awards. Silence of the Lambs broke through this by not advertising itself as a pure horror film, but as a thriller specifically. Due to its widespread critical praise, the film was not only nominated, but won the Academy Award for Best Picture, becoming the first and only horror film in history to do so. By the mid-90s, slasher films were becoming stale. There were a few gems made here and there, such as Bernard Rose's Candyman, featuring the fantastic Tony Todd as the title character, but there was an abundance of cheap, poorly made, rip-off slasher films that were diluting the horror library. The slasher formula was overplayed, the acting and scripts seemed to be getting worse, and audiences as a whole were beginning to get bored of the subgenre, as they all knew the tropes and the scare factor was starting to diminish. Even the titans like Jason, Freddy, Michael, and Leatherface weren't bringing in the audiences or the money that studios wanted. It looked like the age of slasher films was coming to an end, and the subgenre was doomed to peter out into irrelevancy. Or so they thought. In 1996, Studio Dimension Films and Woods Entertainment would release a new slasher film, directed by Wes Craven, the man behind the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. The studios hoped that Craven could pull in audiences for one last scare before the subgenre faded away from the public interest. Little did they know, the movie they released would do the opposite of ending the slasher genre. It revived it. Scream was exactly what the slasher genre needed. The filmmakers knew that the audience had seen all sorts of horror films and knew the tropes that accompanied them, so the filmmakers used this to the movie's advantage. Scream was a love letter to the horror genre, pulling from several different popular horror films in order to create something new. The film is a murder mystery featuring a group of teenage friends who are aware of a mysterious masked killer in their town. Taking inspiration from Black Christmas, the murderer calls his victims on the phone before killing them. No one is sure who it is, and the film keeps the audience on their toes by constantly putting in hints of evidence as to who the killer may actually be. The fun of the film comes from the meta elements thrown into the story. The characters in the movie are horror film fans and are even aware of characters like Jason and Michael Myers. The movie weaves comedy into its narrative flawlessly, having several humorous moments that don't take away from the scares when the film chooses to get serious. Being able to both make fun of itself and other horror films while still delivering a scary experience was exactly the formula needed to bring audiences back. Since then, the Scream franchise has continued to evolve and grow, with its now iconic Ghostface being a staple of the Halloween season, and slotting in nicely to the titans of the horror genre. In the late 90s, Western horror was booming. Scream had inspired a whole new era of self-aware horror that played with the genre's tropes while still fitting in some scare factor. However, on the other side of the world, Japanese filmmaker Hideo Nakata was working on a film that took itself much more seriously. In 1998, he would release a psychological horror film that would strike a chord with audiences worldwide, a film many consider to be the crown jewel of Japanese horror, Ringu. Based on the famous novel, the film is the story of a journalist who is investigating reports of a haunted VHS tape that kills its viewers exactly 7 days after watching it. After watching it herself, it's a race against the clock to uncover the source of the curse in order to save herself and her young son. Unlike the popular slashers of the West at the time, which often prided themselves on their gore and intense chase scenes, Ringu went back to the era of RKO Pictures and used heavy themes of suspense, mystery, and overwhelming dread to deliver its scares. The whole film has a strong sense of isolation, and you truly feel how powerless the characters are at times. The film comes to a climax at the end when the film's main threat is finally shown in all of her glory. The spirit of Sadako Yamamuri crawls through the screen of a television to claim her next victim. The scene was built up so well, and the atmosphere, music, and design of Sadako all come together to create a bone-chilling sequence that stuck with viewers long after the movie was over. The sequence has become so infamous that even people who have never seen the movie can often identify Sadako as the ghost who crawls through TV screens, although this widespread knowledge is significantly impacted by a later film we shall discuss. Ringu was also one of the earlier horror films to make technology a core part of the film, as the concept of a haunted videotape was a relatively new idea, with most cursed items in movies typically being some form of ancient artifact or ritualistic tool. While Ringu didn't get a theatrical release in the West right away, it quickly gained popularity through film festivals, horror movie circles, and word of mouth. The ideas presented in the film caught the interest of American filmmakers, specifically a man by the name of Gore Verbinski, who was sent a copy of the film by his friend Walter F. Parks. Verbinski was fascinated by the film and wanted to find a way to share it with American audiences. Following the theme of videotape-based horror, in 1999 a film was about to release that would mark the transition of the Time of the Titans into the modern era of horror, a film that would sweep the nation, terrifying those who saw it, and leaving many questioning if they believed in the supernatural, a film that would create an entirely new subgenre of horror and would inspire countless other works that would come after, a film whose success was because of a lie. The Blair Witch Project was one of the first of what came to be known as found footage horror movies, films that are presented as seemingly real scenarios with an actual in-universe camera acting as the point of view for the audience. Although not technically the first horror film to do this, that being 1980's Cannibal Holocaust, The Blair Witch Project was the first time the found footage style was popularized and seen by most of the public. The movie itself is very simple. Just the story of a group of 3 filmmakers, Heather, Mike, and Josh, going into the woods to shoot a documentary of the mysterious Blair Witch, a local legend. As the film goes on, more strange events start to happen. They are trapped in the woods, with some supernatural entity seeming to toy with them. Josh eventually disappears altogether, and the others are lured into an old house where, after being drawn into the basement, they are attacked by an unseen force before the camera cuts to black. The film, while definitely having its flaws, did a good job at making the characters seem real, and the camera work was clever at times. The slow build of the film is excellent at creating dread, and the ending leaves you with questions. The film also plays into the idea that not showing the monster can be scarier than showing it at times, especially when it's a supernatural entity. The film felt real, and that's what the creators wanted, but not because they wanted people to admire how realistic it was, but because they told people that it was real. The Blair Witch Project's secret to its success wasn't its writing, pacing, effects, tone, or acting. Its secret was its marketing. By using a cast of unknown actors and the low quality of the film, the creators were able to lie about the film's authenticity, claiming that it was not a work of fiction, but in fact was actual footage from people who really did go missing in the woods. This is what caused the film to be as popular as it was, as without this, the film, while not terrible, isn't really anything all that special outside of its unique presentation. Word spread quickly about the real-life horror film and how it made people question their beliefs and what they knew about the supernatural. People flocked to see it, having to go see for themselves the real footage and what happened to those people. Despite this morally questionable marketing strategy, it paid off. The film made over $248 million on a budget of only $35,000 to $60,000. Eventually, thanks to the rise of the early internet, the film was eventually uncovered to be a hoax, with none of the people, locations, or events being real at all. Despite the public uncovering the truth, this would be a turning point for horror cinema. The advancement of the internet was opening up new possibilities for filmmakers, and society was undergoing some big changes. The 2000s were right around the corner, a new century of horror media. The time of the Titans was over, and a new era of horror was about to begin. As the new century set into place, changes began to occur behind the scenes. The rapid advancement of technology began to affect the filmmaking sphere. Some films began to be shot with digital cameras, making the production process much easier. The improvement and stabilization of the internet allowed for more independent creators to begin working on projects of their own, without needing to rely on big studios. Independent horror productions were about to flourish and help push and test the limits of the horror genre. In 2002, the zombie subgenre would be reignited with the film 28 Days Later, which gave audiences a fresh take on the zombies of old. Rather than a supernatural, risen-from-the-dead storyline that you would find in most films in the subgenre, the movie's zombies were fast, aggressive humans that had been taken over by a virus. This more grounded take on zombies has become a norm for the subgenre, with many similar interpretations appearing over the years. The film was also one of the first horror movies to not be shot on film cameras, instead using newer-age digital cameras. With a surge of independently made horror films on the way, studios wanted to find an anchor to keep them secure when the inevitable wave of competition finally hit. They would find their anchor in 2002, when Gore Verbinski finally got to share his love of Ringu with an American audience. Directed by Verbinski, The Ring is an American remake/reinterpretation of the original Ringu film, following essentially the same plot of a woman investigating the tape and then having to find a way to save both her and her son. The movie at first glance could be considered a ripoff, but Verbinski did make a number of changes in an effort to make the film distinct from Ringu. First of all, the film is obviously not set in Japan, the location instead being Seattle, Washington. The film has a very different color palette, preferring aquatic greens and deep blues. And the movie also makes significant changes to the main spirit, named Samara as opposed to Sadako. The Ring was extremely successful, both due to it being a familiar yet different sight, and also because the film was rated PG-13, which at the time was not common for horror films. Over the years, The Ring and its two sequels, Ring 2 and Rings, have been examined and seen as well-done remakes of the original property. Although sadly, due to The Ring becoming more widespread than Ringu, many common moviegoers don't even know about the original, and often confuse the two films if they are aware of it. The success of The Ring is what the big studios were looking for. Horror remakes had existed, of course, with the era of Hammer horror being a solid example, but the idea of rebooting one's own creative IP in order to bring it into the modern era wasn't very common in the horror genre yet. That changed in 2003 when a studio called Platinum Dunes released a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film had a darker visual style, the family of cannibals was larger, and the effects and acting gave a far bloodier and more brutal film than the original. There is still debate to this day on the quality of the film, especially when compared to the original, but the numbers didn't lie. The film was a massive success, making over 10 times its budget back. People were interested in seeing the titans of the 70s and 80s be brought into the modern era, and so they would be. Jason would come next in 2009, when Platinum Dunes released a remake of Friday the 13th. However, instead of repeating the plot of the first Friday film, this remake was more of a meld of the first four, having Jason as the main killer and explaining how he catches and kills those who trespass on Camp Crystal Lake. The film was well received, but sadly, the Friday franchise has gone cold since the film came out due to a long series of legal disputes that have been causing the franchise to be stuck in a state of limbo. Platinum Dunes would give it another shot the following year when they released a remake of Nightmare on Elm Street. This was by far the most controversial and least liked of the slasher remakes, due to two main reasons. First, the studio had casted Jackie Earle Haley as the new face of Freddy Krueger. Many people were upset because even if Jackie was able to turn in a good performance, it just wasn't the same without having Robert Englund behind the makeup. The second reason is that instead of just making Freddy a child murderer like they had in the original, they went the route of making him a child molester as well. Fans were mostly against this idea, as while it does make him easier to hate, it also sucked a lot of the fun out of the character too, and made him too gross to enjoy watching. The movie did not perform as well as hoped, and is currently the last Nightmare on Elm Street film to be released, with no word on whether or not the franchise will be brought back. Despite the surge of horror remakes featuring both Western reinterpretations of foreign movies like The Grudge and remakes of existing Western films such as Black Christmas, original horror properties still had a lot to offer. In 2004, the studio Twisted Pictures would release a new film that would shock audiences, while also leaving them hungry for more. Directed by James Wan, Saw was both a psychological horror, a splatter film, and a mystery all at the same time. The film pulls from a lot of popular escape room attractions, but gives it a horror film makeover. The main villain, John Kramer, also known as Jigsaw, was unique because despite being a killer, he always left people a way out and kept his word to let them live. This type of antagonist created a perfect formula for suspense, as you never knew if a character would find a way out of one of his many death traps or not. The first film was a huge success, and Twisted Pictures would release several sequels, one per year from 2004 to 2010, ending with the original storyline in Saw 3D in 2010. Two spin-off films would follow, those being Jigsaw and Spiral. Although good in many respects, both were seen as lacking when compared to the earlier films. The franchise's newest inclusion was when Saw 10 was released, which, much to audiences' delight, was just as good as the first few films, with many fans declaring it as their new favorite. John Kramer, played by Tobin Bell, is the standout performance of the franchise, and has become one of the best horror antagonists of the modern era. Despite dying at the end of Saw 3, Kramer's influence looms over the whole franchise in the form of his apprentices, who take up the role of Jigsaw after he dies. The Saw franchise is mainly known for two things, the first, of course, being the death traps, many of which were actually constructed behind the scenes, although no one was ever hurt, and the second was the iconic twists. Each Saw film has a twist towards the end, with audiences often being blown away by the reveals even if they were aware and looking for clues as to what the secret may be. In a way, watching a Saw movie included a puzzle for the viewers, trying to piece things together while being entertained by the acting, music, and spectacular gore. It was a fitting addition to the movies, as Jigsaw's iconic line goes.
I want to play a game.
Sadly, Saw would undergo the same treatment films like The Thing and Texas Chainsaw had to suffer through. Despite the franchise's gripping story, good acting, and intriguing mysteries, all that the media focused on were the intense death scenes, making it seem as if each movie was just watching people die in horrible ways. The term torture porn was popularized to label the film and others like it. This prejudice against violent horror films would persist over the years and continues to turn people away from great franchises due to having been fed misinformation about the movie's purpose. People were experimenting with the horror genre more than ever before, and it was paying off. In 2007, a studio by the name of Blumhouse would release their first film, titled Paranormal Activity. The film, similar to the Blair Witch Project, was a found footage movie, although it was not presented as actual events. Despite this, the film was still extremely distressing for audiences and made $193 million on a tiny budget of only $15,000. This enormous hit was what Blumhouse needed to push themselves into the horror mainstream, and the company began working on a number of other projects shortly after. That same year, one of the most unique horror films ever made would also be released. Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street was a horror musical/slasher flick starring Johnny Depp as the title character. Horror musicals are very rare in the filmmaking world, especially ones that take themselves seriously rather than being a parody of the genre. The film is a marvel to both look at and listen to, drowning itself in the gothic overtones of 1840s London, and is filled to the brim with phenomenal actors including Alan Rickman and Helena Bonham Carter. The movie stood out due to how different of an experience it was when compared to other horror films, and its success continued to help studios and filmmakers be more open to strange and unorthodox ideas for horror films. Despite victories here and there for independent creators, for much of the late 2000s, mainstream horror was not doing especially well. The market was oversaturated with remakes of varying quality, and many films were falling into the trap of being too focused on having extreme gore over quality writing or interesting cinematography. The genre felt worn out in a lot of ways. However, with the arrival of the 2010s, what many people consider to be the revival of horror began. Streaming services and online platforms were becoming more and more popular, and had never been easier for creators to turn their ideas into productions. Horror television series like American Horror Story began to pick up widespread attention, and fans of the horror genre had never had more content to chew on. In 2010, Blumhouse, with the help of the creators of the Saw franchise, would release a supernatural horror film called Insidious. The film stood out against other horror movies at the time due to its very unique style, clever cinematography, and well-written scares. It lacked the blood and guts that many other films were showcasing, rather focusing on atmosphere, build-up, and intense jump scares. The movie was a return to form for the psychological horror subgenre, pivoting away from the more gritty realism of films such as The Hills Have Eyes or The Devil's Rejects, in favor of going back to the ominous lighting and quiet moments found in classic Gothic horror. The film struck a chord with people and ignited the trend of supernatural horror that would dominate mainstream horror in the 2010s. Following the success of films like Insidious and 2012's Sinister, in 2013 The Conjuring would be released by New Line Cinema. The film on its own follows the supernatural horror style very well, but what made it so special was its inspiration. Based on the reports of real-life paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, the movie's claim of being based on true events helped draw more people in. With the success of the film, New Line Cinema began to work on a series of other films also based off the various artifacts and investigations Ed and Lorraine had acquired and gone on during their time, with each film being loosely connected to the others. This series formed one of the only successful cinematic universes found in the horror genre. Supernatural horror opened up opportunities for much more personal interactions and themes than most other subgenres did, due to the inherent psychological focus of the films. Such an example is the 2014 film The Babadook. The movie was extremely surreal, with the line between what was real and not being intentionally blurred, and that, along with its haunting antagonist, stellar cinematography, and great performances, and you would get a truly disturbing experience that stuck with the audiences after the film was over. The Babadook showed how focusing more on the victims and less on the threat itself can help with the scare factor at times, as too much exposure to an antagonist can make them seem less threatening. Creators took note of this, and main characters in horror began to get more focus and development than they had in previous years. Moving back to Blumhouse, that same year they would release one of their best-known horror films, and one that is regarded as one of the greatest of the modern era. Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele, is a psychological horror film that tackles some very controversial subjects, including racism, manipulation, and one's own personal prejudices. The film was a critical home run, with it being the 6th horror film to be nominated for Best Picture, and even having Jordan Peele be nominated for Best Director on his very first ever theatrical film. The film was an excellent example of how to weave current world problems and messaging into a horror narrative and have the story flow seamlessly. Since then, Jordan Peele has continued to explore the horror genre, releasing films such as 2019's Us and 2022's Nope, both of which were also highly regarded. Due to his creativity and vision for frightening concepts, he is said by many to be one of the best horror directors of the modern era. The following year, in 2017, the horror genre would dive back into the depths of Stephen King's novels, as one of his most popular stories would be adapted for the big screen. It was a big gamble for New Line Cinema. As one of King's most famous novels, second only to maybe The Shining, there was a lot of pressure to ensure that the film was able to evoke the fear that the book had been known for. The story had been adapted to screen once before, in a 1990 miniseries that, while enjoyed by many, was fairly divisive on the actual quality of the production. The story of It had a lot of pieces to it, but in the face of the story is undoubtedly King's most famous monster, Pennywise the Clown. Previously portrayed by Tim Curry, audiences weren't sure if New Line would be able to find anyone who could give the role the energy and scare factor needed to pull off such an iconic villain. Luckily, Bill Skarsgård was cast as the infamous Killer Clown, and he delivered a fantastic performance, different enough from what came before, but still kept the spirit of the demonic clown fully intact. It quickly cemented itself in the minds of audiences, and Pennywise immediately jumped onto many people's scariest horror villain lists. The film broke records, becoming the highest-grossing horror film ever made, at over $704 million worldwide, and having the biggest September opening of any film in history. The writing was clear as day. Pennywise was here to stay, and the character had continued to be relevant over the years, appearing in the film's sequel in 2019, and is scheduled to appear in a prequel TV show titled Welcome to Derry. Horror was thriving. Shows like Haunting of Hill House were delivering on the episodic horror that fans were looking for. Internet horror had never been bigger, sparking off into several internet horror exclusive subgenres such as analog horror. And theatrical horror films were continuing to push the boundaries and experiment with different ideas and themes. 2019's folk horror film Midsummer played with the idea of a horror movie that's set in broad daylight. Films like Hellfest and Haunt played with the idea of having slasher films set in scare attractions. Ready or Not harkened back to films like The Evil Dead by having a film where the victim actively fights back against the antagonists. And movies like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark use their PG-13 rating to act as bridges to bring younger viewers into the horror film fanbase. More recently, horror has been continuing to expand and grow as a genre. Internet horror is at an all-time high. Films such as Heart Eyes and the modern Scream films keep the slasher genre going strong. Movies like Talk to Me and the Smile franchise continuing to explore and expand on the psychological and supernatural subgenres. And every once in a while, you even have the oddballs, such as the horror comedy The Monkey, which fully engrossed itself in the goofier side of the genre. Horror continues to delight audiences far and wide, and many are waiting eagerly for the next breakthrough in terror-based entertainment. Horror has been around for so long, and a lot has changed since the first recorded frights hit the silver screen all those years ago. The world looks different, tech has advanced dramatically, and what once may have left audiences terrified now may leave them amused. As time has gone on, we have seen the highs and lows of the horror genre, and the various subgenres that it encompasses. The horror genre has been a core aspect of entertainment over these years, and its impact on the filmmaking industry is one that deserves to be remembered and respected. I thank you for taking the time to accompany me down this blood-soaked rabbit hole, and I hope you learn a thing or two about the rich history of my personal favorite entertainment genre. Until we meet again.
No.